Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Greg Phillips with 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Communications. Russia attacked Ukraine overnight with tanks rolling across the border and missiles targeting multiple military installations. Western governments have promised additional sanctions in response. We have two 𝐓𝐡𝐞 experts with us today to discuss the current conditions and the various factors that could determine what happens next. With us today is Bruce Jentleson. He is a professor of public policy and political science at 𝐓𝐡𝐞, who served as senior advisor in the State Department from 2009 to 11, and is author of the Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from 20th-Century Statesmanship. Also joining us is Simon Miles. He's an assistant professor in the Stanford School of Public Policy at 𝐓𝐡𝐞, where he studies Russia and the former Soviet Union. He is the author of Engaging the Evil Empire, an account of how Washington and Moscow overcame their differences to end the Cold War. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Professor Miles, we'll start with you. You are currently in Bucharest, as coincidence would have it, but obviously an awful lot happened overnight. What are the current conditions as best we understand them?
So thanks, Greg. And just to avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to things in local time as far as morning and afternoon, which is not only the time they're unfolding in Ukraine, but the time in which I'm witnessing them. Happened beginning at about 5 o'clock in the morning when Vladimir Putin gave a speech declaring what he has been calling a special military action, but which can properly be considered war on Ukraine. And before he was even finished that speech, we saw a launching of a significant quantity of cruise missiles. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is saying there were 30 launches. I think it's not unreasonable to think that there are even more than that. Various precision-guided munitions hitting targets in Ukraine, including very deep in Ukraine, though this has not been the sort of comprehensive strikes a la the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which a lot of people, including myself, were expecting would be the initial phase of hostilities here. Those are targeting airfields, air defense systems, command and control, supply and ammunition depots, and major infrastructure targets. We're seeing burning buildings in Kyiv. We're seeing even in Lviv, which is in the extreme west of Ukraine, very close to the Polish border, strikes which are so close that air raid sirens are going off in Poland. As a result of this, we're also seeing extensive use of what are called multiple launch rocket systems. These are not precision munitions. Rather, these are sort of dumb rounds, which can cause extraordinary damage at significant range, which reflects the Russian military's heavy focus on the extensive use of artillery at the tactical range. We're seeing, for example, civilian casualties already from these much less surgical strikes in towns like Kharkiv. I think it's important to note that the Russians could not launch this war at night. Their military is still inadequately equipped with the sensors and sort of wayfinding equipment, which is necessary to do this type of military operation at night. They had to wait until the morning to start. The Ukrainian Air Force right now has been largely rendered ineffective. It was always very small, though there was very, very recent footage of an aerial engagement over Kyiv. The airfields have largely been eliminated, though Ukrainian air defenses are still, somewhat functional, and we're seeing Russian helicopters on the outskirts is putting it mildly of Kyiv being taken down with man-portable anti-aircraft defenses like Stinger missiles. The Ukrainian military has not been routed as many people expected them to be. There's a lot of footage of destroyed Russian vehicles and aircraft. They've been able to perform something of a fighting retreat, basically using space to buy time. There are sort of three main areas of military activity that I think are important to point out, and the Ukrainian MOD right now says that 40 servicemen have lost their lives in the fighting. I think that's a number that is going to go up pretty rapidly by the hour. So first, from the south, we've seen a massive Russian incursion coming out of Crimea, where the Ukrainian lines have basically collapsed. Those Russian troops are capturing bridgeheads on the Dnieper River, which divides Ukraine on an east on an east-west basis, and they're focusing on the city of Kherson, which is very important strategically because it's through there that a canal, which until the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine was used to supply Crimea, runs. So that's strategically really important to Russia's continuing position. In the north, there's a major force moving on Kharkiv. They appear to be getting bogged down around the city. They're setting up checkpoints, etc., where they are cordoning off that city. I think it's fair to say that the Ukrainian defenders are hoping to lure them into urban combat, where Russia's massive advantage in terms of armor and things like that is less of a decisive factor. But right now, the place that I'm watching most closely is a suburb of Kyiv called Hostomel, which is within Kyiv Oblast, right? So it's really within the immediate geographic vicinity, where an airport, which is used by the Ukrainian military and is also used by the Antonov aircraft manufacturing company. They're the ones who make the Antonov Mriya, which is the largest transport aircraft in the world. It's being reported on in the press, in the Western press right now, as the Antonov Airport. We're talking about a sizable airport, about 15 minutes drive away from the Kyiv Ring Road, which now it seems has been taken by a massive Russian heliborne assault. It's important to note that this is basically the only Ukrainian military airfield which was not pummeled with cruise missile strikes. And the reason for that, I think it's fair to say, is that they're preparing for a much larger airborne insertion to include landing armored vehicles. If the Russians are able to land, a sizable number of armored vehicles and troops that close to Kyiv's borders, I think that puts the Ukrainian government in a very, very dangerous situation. And it's worth mentioning that this is exactly what the Russians did in Kazakhstan mere months ago. This is a carbon copy of that operation. There's also a massive amphibious Russian force sitting off the coast of the Ukrainian city of Odessa, which is a major city, though they haven't made a move yet, contrary to some erroneous reporting of an amphibious landing, which came out early on. So those are the main sort of military events that are going on right now. One last point I just want to make is that it's striking that Russia's very significant electronic warfare and cyber warfare capabilities up to now have been kept largely limited. I think that's entirely intentional. I think they want Ukrainians to see what's happening and they want to erode their morale. Telecom networks in Kharkiv proper are down or struggling. But for example, in Kyiv, cell phone networks, et cetera, are still going. And I think that that's part of the information and sort of propagandistic part of this ploy, that they are hoping that Ukrainians see what's happening and give up. And we haven't seen any sign of that yet. I'll leave it there, Greg.
Absolutely, thank you. Certainly lots to follow up on there. But Professor Jentleson, I'd like to move over to you for a moment. Obviously, a lot of eyes are going to be looking at the US now and how the US will respond. What's your take on that? What President Biden has done so far? What we might expect to see from the US in the days to come?
Yeah, there have been a number of elements to the president's strategy up to this point, which was largely intended to try to deter Putin from invading. And as Simon said, we're beyond the semantics right now. This isn't an incursion, an intervention, not even an invasion, it's a war. So just to tick off a few of those, we can come back to them. So one was being very clear that the United States has no intention of sending military forces into Ukraine. A lot of factors go into that. The most significant, I think, is that you don't fight a war where you're so outnumbered and it's right on the border of your adversary. Indeed, throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained a conventional military advantage over NATO that was compensated, checked, if you will, by nuclear deterrence. The president was very clear about that. He's explained the reasons. They're strategic, not just political. Second element, I think, though, has been significant military aid to the Ukrainians. Over $200 million in additional aid from the United States in recent weeks and months, beyond what we've been giving before. some also from some allies, from Poland, from some of the Baltic countries, from the Brits, and from the Germans as well. And I think the goal there is not so much to mount, as Simon said, this is the Russian version of shock and awe, even though it has its limits right now. But thinking a bit long term, and we can come back to that, about a resistance that could be there over time and have a significant impact. Sanctions have been another element that have been that swift and severe, crippling, devastating. These are all terms the administration has used. My own view of that is that they've been oversold. And again, I'll come back to that in just a second. But they've been an important element. Intelligence has been a very, I think, interesting element because, now with somebody very capable like CIA Director William Burns, one of the most experienced diplomats we have, actually was ambassador to Russia in the 1990s, was Deputy Secretary of State, the #2 position in the Obama administration. With Burns running the CIA, let's just say it's getting back a lot of its competence from the ways that was threatened during the Trump years. And we got out in front with a whole bunch of information. Some of it may have been from a mole, some of it may have been electronic, that the Russians are going to mount a false flag operation. This was an effort to control the narrative. And if Putin had done that, and then you said, oh, it's really false flag, it's harder to make that case and frame it. And so the way we've used intelligence, as well as the ways we don't know about military operations has been very, very important. And the diplomacy, bringing the alliance together. NATO was originally formed to deal with a Soviet threat. The Trump years were pretty awful for NATO, but it's fair to say, I was in the Obama administration State Department, and relations inside NATO weren't perfect then either. NATO was, had its tensions and stuff, and bringing the alliance together has taken an enormous amount of diplomatic effort. And then the president has also tried to keep the American people informed. He's speaking again today. He's been trying to keep the American people informed so they know where things are going, so they know what he's doing. Some critics have been, all over the map, from the Tucker Carlsons and some Republicans saying, not our business, let Putin have his way, or Trump sort of saying, hey, that's a good model for what to do on the southern border, to others saying you should be tougher. And you should go in militarily. It's a lot easier for somebody to say from a perch in the Congress, where if it doesn't work, they could still blame you for how it didn't work, than the way the president's put together the elements. It hasn't succeeded in the deterrence function. And so now we get into the question of what to do next. But I'll stop there, Greg, and sort of pick it up as you want with questions or further information.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And we will open it up to questions now. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance. We'll get through as many of those as we can. You can also post questions via the Q&A window at any time. If you'd like to ask a question in person, raise your hand in Zoom and we'll unmute you when your turn comes around. And if you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Professor Miles, I'd like to come back to you. Obviously, everybody wants to know what's going to happen next. And of course, we don't know. But you mentioned how so far this has been a carbon copy of what Putin did in Kazakhstan several years ago. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what happened there and whether you think there's anything we can take from that to suggest what might happen in Ukraine moving forward.
Sure. So just to be clear, the carbon copy is the specific landing of a major sized, battalion size plus airborne element, complete with a sizable complement of armored vehicles. That is militarily really hard to do. It's very hard to do right. It's something that the Russians exercise on a regular basis. Regularly, a big part of their major annual exercises include this type of heliborne assault with a follow-up airborne landing. So this is very much a tool that the Russians have worked really hard to hone. Now, we've seen that the Ukrainians have had some success in downing Russian aircraft. Very recently, really close to the northern borders of Kyiv, one helicopter, one attack helicopter was down. One of the pilots managed to eject from it. So what we're seeing here is a lot of what the Russians have really built their military to do, playing out not on the exercise field. So to go back to Kazakhstan, I think there's two important points to be made there. The first was that Russia's active early involvement was, I think, about the same anxieties that Vladimir Putin feels about Ukraine today. And that was to ensure that Kazakhstan remained within Russia's sphere of influence, and also to prevent the Kazakh people from exercising control over or having a say in their form of government, as of course the events in Kazakhstan were triggered by protests over a massive spike in gas prices there. That is, a driver, I think, of how he sees Ukraine, just as it is of various other countries. The second point is that the Russian military demonstrated a capacity in Kazakhstan for power projection at speed, which I think a lot of people didn't think that they would be able to do. We've been seeing a lot of this capacity developed since the initiation of major reforms in the Russian military in 2008. We saw it on display in Syria. We saw it on display in Kazakhstan. And now we are seeing it on a much larger scale playing out here in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Thank you. Professor Jentleson, moving back to you, you've talked about these three different elements, military, diplomacy, sanctions. You wrote in the Washington Post earlier this month that sanctions just by the US alone might not have that much effect because Russia does so much more business with Europe. We're seeing some European governments pledge to add to sanctions. How much difference do you think sanctions can make if they come at Russia from multiple fronts? Can they actually have a role in de-escalating what's going on?
They can, but they shouldn't be oversold. A lot of the discussion of sanctions has been, oh my goodness, look at all the tools we have, dollar-denominated transactions in international markets, sanctioning Putin and his cronies. But it's just like military force in the sense that you got a war game. There's an offense and a defense. Putin, for example, has accumulated $640 billion in hard currency reserves that buys him a certain amount of insulation. So in the sense of sanctions being a major part of the deterrent, we've seen that didn't work. Where they can work is combined with other elements. I mean, my sense of what are some of the keys to where we go from here are ensuring that the sanctions impose costs. Holding the alliance, like you said, together is already, the Belgians are arguing that they could still sell diamonds and the Italians luxury goods. To be honest with you, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that everybody focuses on is a pipeline that hasn't started pumping yet. And all that's happened is that the permitting to turn it on has been stopped, delayed. It can be turned on at any point down the road. And Americans are already, oil is at $100 a barrel now. So we're feeling some consequences economically. But the Europeans get an enormous amount of their oil and gas from the Russians, and so the cost to them over time are greater. So I think you impose the cost you can, and frankly, I think the best part, the metaphor some people use is a porcupine strategy. Militarily, that you're trying to provide the assistance and some of the weaponry to the Ukrainians, their former military, and what will probably become an insurgency, so that they can raise the cost to Putin. That destabilization is a lot easier than stabilization. And frankly, since 2014, that's what Putin's done. Destabilize Ukraine. Not very costly to Russia. Some sanctions, not a lot of body bags coming home. But invading and doing the kind of things that Simon talked about to take over the country, he's going to be in charge of stabilization now. The Soviets went through that in Afghanistan. And that's one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union. We went through it in Afghanistan. And so I think part of the goal for the United States now is not so much just a long-term strategy looking out in the future, but a medium-term one. United Nations, for example, the Secretary General has been hugely outspoken, and the UN can go around the Security Council through what's called the Uniting for Peace resolution through the General Assembly. The more voices that are out there, even China, which made this statement of Putin at the Olympics that we're, friendships of no limits, doesn't necessarily want to go too far with Putin because it endangers their interests. So sanctions, military aid to make it costlier for Russia to maintain an occupation, diplomatic pressure from all sorts of directions. These are really parts of the strategy that aren't going to give you results tomorrow, but make a lot of sense to get to where you want to go.
Sure, absolutely. And Professor Jentleson, I'd like to stay with you. We've had a number of questions from our local and national reporters about what kind of impacts we could expect to see on the US, whether cyber attacks, supply chain issues, gas prices. What kind of ripples do you think that average families going about their business in the US can expect to see as a result of this conflict?
Well, definitely gas prices. Those are quite susceptible. And no matter what we can convince the Saudis to do to increase production, energy prices are not only about supply and demand; they're about confidence level. Don't look at your stock portfolio for a while. It's been going down. It's been going down in Russia. It's been going down everywhere. Markets react to that, so people will feel it in our markets. And Putin and the people around him have talked about what they called military technological. Simon may have the exact interpretation. Measures. There'll probably be some hacking. We can hack back. So we will feel effects. There'll be less than the Europeans feel, surely less than the Ukrainians. But the world is interconnected in that way. And, people need to understand that. And the president has been trying to make that case. There's not going to be anything like 1973, as far as I can tell, when we had the OPEC embargo, and gas prices went up 400%. Gas was rationed, lines were at the service stations and the like, but there will be some impact on people's economics and daily lives.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Miles, coming back to you and the Russian perspective here, some of the argument that this wouldn't happen was based around the fact that there was a sense that President Putin did not want to be responsible for occupying and stabilizing Ukraine in the way that Professor Jentleson just said, but this seems to have happened now. So what do you think what are the stakes for President Putin here? Is it possible that he's overextended himself? Do you think that the end game changes for him now? And how's this seen from a Russian perspective?
So before the very lengthy historical speech that President Putin gave a couple days ago about, Ukraine not having a tradition of statehood and just lie after lie, I was one of the people, I was one of the people who really didn't think that he could balance the risk-reward equation. The man that I saw giving that speech, and also in this very long, bizarre, grievance-filled speech, and also a deeply odd convening of his National Security Council, in which he basically publicly humiliated his chief foreign policy aides. Sergei Naryshkin, who is the head of the SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence agency, was particularly, subjected to this treatment, as he very visibly did not want to go along with this and had grave reservations. And Putin harangued him and humiliated him. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that was a pre-taped meeting. They could have edited that out just to him saying an enthusiastic yes, but they kept it in and played it extensively. That man was a very different Vladimir Putin than I think we've seen before. We've seen glimpses of it in, for example, his speech to the Munich Security Conference of 2007, but we've never seen, I think, a version of him who was that disconnected in many senses from reality. The people around him, the so-called siloviki, are supposed to be foaming at the mouth for this. They're supposed to be the ultra hawks who can't wait to start this war, who are really enthusiastic. It was very clear that the key players, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, Sergei Shoigu, the minister of defense, were trying to melt into their chairs. None of these people want a part of this, and Putin seems to know that and not care, but he still makes them sort of go through the ring, the motions, kiss the ring, so on and so forth. So this is a very different side of Putin that we've seen, and I think there are a few factors that are shaping this. I think, frankly, extensive COVID isolation or fear of COVID isolation is one of them. Recent arrests of some Russian-linked Ukrainian oligarchs has been another, as kind of putting paid to some of his ideas for how he might exercise control of Ukraine. But I think that right now we're seeing a Russian leader who is who is making strategic decisions in an extremely emotive, extremely kind of grievance-fueled way. It's worth noting, I think, the extent to which this is not popular in Russia. Right? Big celebrities. So one example, a guy named Ivan Urgant, who is kind of like the Jimmy Fallon of Russia, if you will. He hosts a very analogous late night, very comedic sort of talk show, is openly speaking out against this. This is a man whose entire career is on state TV, and who will likely pay a pretty serious price. The city of Moscow's culture department, which bankrolls basically all of the major theaters in Russia, has already said that any anti-war statements by actors will be treated as treason. So there's a disconnect between Putin and the Russian public. There's a disconnect between Putin and his sort of what in any other country would be his core leadership team, which has now been kind of reduced to a gaggle of yes men and one yes woman. And that's dangerous. I think there's no other way to say it. That's dangerous. And I think that his comments in the declaration of war very early this morning about what he would do if the United States or any other party were to become directly involved, which were a very thinly veiled nuclear threat, need to be taken very seriously given what appears to be his present state of mind.
Let me just pop in there on what Simon said, if I can, Greg. I mean, I think it's really important. We have a tendency with leaders around the world to either, over stress how great they are, great chess players. Putin is this great chess player. Xi Jinping is this great player, or demonize them, right? We did that with Saddam Hussein, and to a certain extent, we're doing that with Putin. A couple of points. One, I think as you're seeing, and as Simon had laid out, is this is not a very, good chess game. It's pretty clear that while many Russians agree, sort of agree with a lot of notions about Ukraine, when they annexed Crimea, very high support. Well, it was cost free. It didn't really take much of a military action. There were some sanctions. David Ignatius had a column in the Washington Post the other day, feeding off a journalist from the Financial Times, about some of these simmerings, and that stage taping was really weird, right? Really weird. And at the same time, so 2 points. One is, there's not going to be Kazakh style rioting in the streets, right? But we have seen, Soviet and Russian leaders moved aside before for certain foreign policy moves. Khrushchev was in 1964 after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Obviously, Gorbachev was 1991. Yeltsin was for different reasons. And so we shouldn't discount some of that, and the notion of continuing to make this more costly for the Russians. Sanctions, military aid is really important. At the same time, we also need to know that the notion of Ukraine's membership in NATO as a threat to Russia is not just Putin's idea. Bill Burns, who I mentioned before, when he was ambassador to Russia in the 1990s, sent back a memo that is actually declassified, in which he said most Russian experts he knew then, even in the days of Yeltsin, were concerned about NATO expansion, less so into Eastern Europe, but into the former Soviet republics, other than the Baltics, was a concern. That issue is going to be there. What Putin has done is made it more likely that Ukraine might go into NATO someday. But the question of, if we get out of this crisis, what European security looks like, is not just, Putin's taking it way far with his romantic views of history and distorted views of history. But it's not just in his mind. It's a real issue for Russia that we would still have to deal with as we look down the road.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that subject, so I wanted to move to that. Professor Miles, I'm going to come back to you, but Professor Jentleson, also want your take on this too. Professor Miles, you're currently in Bucharest, in Romania, which has been a member of NATO since 2004. Professor Jentleson's already talked about the various reasons why we won't see American troops in Ukraine. But is there a sense there that the NATO allies on kind of the eastern edge of NATO would like to see more support from other NATO nations, including the US? Is there a desire to see more of a presence there? And when we come back to you, Professor Jentleson, I'd be interested if you would expect to see any more US troops move to the eastern members of NATO. But what's the sense that you have first, Professor Miles?
Well, I think throughout this entire process that culminated this morning, we've seen a pretty clear divide between NATO's more Eastern and more Western members, right? In that political leaders in countries like Lithuania and Poland, I think, have been much more assertive on the threat posed by Russia, whereas, for example, we've seen the French and the Germans sort of make effort, and the British too, to make efforts at sort of negotiating and things like that. I think the way that the Russian leadership treated, for example, Liz Truss, when they tried and to a certain extent succeeded in sort of humiliating her for being ignorant of what's actually going on. And also a lot of Putin's comments about President Macron being uninformed, and I think make clear that those efforts probably weren't going to succeed. So here in Romania, there are already American troops who have been shifted over from bases in Germany. My conversations today, really focused on how reassuring that feels, and a hope that more are coming soon. Romania has a border with Ukraine. It has a small border in the extreme south, quite close, for example, to the major city of Odessa on the Black Sea. And then it has a larger border to the north. In between them is Moldova, to include the sort of breakaway Republic of Transnistria, which is a whole other area of Russian sort of meddling in the Eastern European security sphere. So there's, I think, a sense of reassurance at the current sort of American deployments, but also a pretty strong desire for more reassurance. There are a lot of ethnic Ukraine, in this part of the world, those borders you don't just neatly have Romanians on one side and Ukrainians on the other side, right? So there are a lot of people who have, deep ethnic and personal ties to Ukraine and vice versa. And thus, this is obviously a very emotional issue for those people.
Yeah, I would say, this is where a lot of our neighbors from Fort Bragg have been deployed, is to other NATO member countries. And that is a deterrent effort. Somewhat analogous when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait to what we did in Saudi Arabia. We're going to, don't go further. That's a real deterrent, and we do have a treaty commitment there. If Putin were to test that, then the risks run very high, because the whole NATO strategy in the Cold War and after was what was often referred to as the plate glass strategy. You had enough American troops there that you break the plate of glass and then it gets a response. Well, again, because of the conventional balance that NATO could never match with the Soviet Union and Russia right there, one of the risks was starting to escalate up that ladder towards nuclear confrontation. And that's a real risk, no matter whose fault it is, obviously. So there are a lot of uncertainties here, but I think that the NATO commitment has to be firm. And I think that's something that President Biden has spent much of his career affirming. His top leaders, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, Avril Haines, who's Director of National Intelligence, are all committed to that. So we could see some real risk. I know I saw some questions in the Q&A, including from Howard LaFranchi. Hey, Howard, good to sort of see you along these lines. The comparisons to Czechoslovakia and Hitler, just don't hold. This is such a totally different situation. And it's not always, that was flawed diplomacy for a lot of reasons. That Chamberlain said, fine, it's yours. And the United States, by the way, didn't join the war till 2 years after it started. So right now we're trying to deter and control the crisis. It would be great, and this is something, if it happens, we'll only know about it way, way down the road, if there are some quiet back channel talks going on right now. I'm not saying there are. and it's not something that I think open journalists would find, because they may need to be. That's what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis that helped diffuse it. And so there are a lot of elements that may be there that are really important. But the primary goal right now is to ensure that Putin doesn't go further, and at the same time de-escalate, if not resolve, the crisis.
Absolutely. And I think just one quick point on that, a really important role for American troops in bordering countries like Romania and Poland is going to be dealing with the refugee flows. We're already seeing in Kyiv, for example, huge exodus of people, and that's continuing. Countries like Romania, Poland to a lesser extent, are not equipped to deal with that. That's going to be a massive logistical challenge to get these people, housed and fed and in a sanitary conditions. That's something that we know a lot of the U.S. military presence is targeted towards. So there is also an important element there for the U.S. military presence in helping some of these countries who face their own challenges to absorb, at least on a temporary basis, people fleeing the fighting, and we are seeing people starting to do that right now.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you both. And Professor Jentleson, I appreciate you referring to that question in the Q&A where I was going to go next, which was, of course, comparing what's happened in Ukraine to some of the beginnings of World War II, and it's certainly reassuring to hear you say that those two situations are very different. But Professor Miles, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, it's clear, as you've said from your comments of what Putin has done, is that trying to kind of build Russia's sphere of influence or maintain it in the way that the Soviet Union existed. I mean, for people in Eastern Europe, is there a fear that his ambitions might go beyond the nations that comprise the Soviet Union and might have designs on more of Eastern Europe? Or is there a feeling that, no, his ultimate goal is to rebuild the Soviet empire and the influence that it held when it existed?
So I obviously can't speak for everyone here, and I can only speak based on my, the conversations I've been having, today with folks here in Romania. And I think that there is a mix of fear and some confidence. On the one hand, certainly I think there's a universal sense that if you wondered why we wanted into NATO in the 90s, this is why, right? We kind of were under the Russian yoke for the latter half of the 20th century. And when we were free to choose our security orientation, we chose NATO because we feared Russia. And this is sort of proof of why that wasn't hysteria, why that wasn't sort of just a ploy, but rather that had some justification. And there's been a lot of debate about the wisdom of NATO expansion, but certainly I think there's a strong sense in the countries of Eastern Europe right now that it is because of NATO expansion that they don't believe that they're next. I agree with Bruce that I think the risk of taking this beyond Ukraine would be enormous to Vladimir Putin, and I think he knows that. I think he's aware. I think he takes that threat very seriously, and indeed, a lot of his language has really been focused on the disposition of Ukraine. He's made comments about, moving NATO's military presence back to pre-1997 positioning, but on that he has several times indicated that there's he's willing to negotiate on that. Issues like Ukraine's future NATO membership, he's made clear through his diplomats that he's not willing to negotiate on. Now, I think what Bruce said earlier is really important, that in many ways he's the architect of his own misery right now. Right? There are going to be conversations in Helsinki and Stockholm about NATO membership, which would not have happened if this weren't playing out. But in Eastern Europe, I think there's a sense of security. Certainly, it was a normal day in Bucharest today. I did everything I was planning to do today, if nothing had changed, except for joining you on this Zoom. So there is a strong sense of normalcy in that regard, and I think that NATO is giving people a sense of safety in that regard.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Jentleson, I'd like to come back to the kind of US lens on this. Obviously, the issue of NATO became a thing during President Trump's era, and claims that other nations should be doing, more, paying more for their share for NATO. As this clearly, obviously, President Biden has a lot of foreign policy experience. This is a massive challenge for him, how he handles this. How much of a difference does his handling of this make to his presidency, how it's seen or its chances of continuing beyond the next election? Is this a big domestic issue for the president?
Well, it is. Let me say the ways in which it has its limits. Very rarely does foreign policy affect the way people vote in elections. Midterm elections, even less so. And so there are some scenarios out of this in which it could have an impact. Most of those are really awful, like major escalation. If he helps provide leadership to resolve this, I think in some ways for his foreign policy reputation, among a sort of chattering class, it'll help, particularly after Afghanistan. But there are a lot of other issues. So I think there's a downside risk greater than an upside gain for him domestically, politically. I think the question of where it goes, I agree with Simon's points about NATO. It's worth pointing out too that we can't lose sight of countries like Poland and Hungary, for which the greatest threat to democracy is not Putin, but their own leaders. And to the extent that we care about that, we can't lose sight of that in the immediate moment. So I think and the other interesting thing about Poles, you don't see a lot of American, support like you did when Saddam invaded Kuwait, which again didn't have it as much on 2003 Iraq. And there's a very interesting 2 point. The Republican Party is all over the map. You have Trump, the current candidate, J.D. Vance, who people know from Hillbilly Elegy, running for the Republican nomination in Ohio for the Senate for an open seat, is very much of the who cares about Ukraine, let Putin have what he wants. Former President Trump has said that. And then you have sort of the Lindsey Grahams who are sort of trying to out-hawk. So they've got a real problem in their party for where they are in foreign policy. Democrats too, but maybe less so. But generationally, there's also, the polls are really showing, younger generations, called millennials and Gen Z, are even less supportive than older generations of major military action here. We've seen that in other polls as well, that go back to other, getting out of Iraq, getting out of Afghanistan and stuff. So it kind of gets at some really interesting political dynamics. But for the president, his political fate is really much more geared to Build Back Better, Supreme Court justice, and those sorts of things that are domestic.
Absolutely, thank you. We're going to wrap up here fairly shortly. Professor Miles, I wanted to come back to you, and you talked about this in the beginning, but when we look at what happens next, should we just basically expect to see Ukraine bedding down for some urban warfare, as will be an active resistance there to whatever Russia is trying to do, but kind of a period where we can just expect that to be the ongoing thing, or would you expect other major shifts in policy or a Russia approach to this situation, in the next few days or weeks?
Well, I think the basic Russian military and operational approach here is speed. This is not something that Putin wants to drag out. And I think that's why he's trying to secure an air bridgehead mere miles from Kyiv. If they're able to effect a sizable landing there, I think we would see the Ukrainian government be put in a position where they really have very few options, confronted with armor, Russian mechanized infantry and armor, moving not just on Kyiv, but basically in Kyiv. They do not want protracted military engagement here. I don't think they want to occupy very much of Ukraine very long. They might take a bit more of the sort of Donbass region, maybe expand a land bridge out from Crimea. But an occupation here would be bloody and it would be difficult. And there is no evidence to suggest from their occupation and similar activities in 2014, 2015 that it would go well. for them, and that is very alive in the memories of Russian military leaders who, even if they're not able to shape some of the grand strategic choices, those calls are being made. I think it's very clear just by one man, and that's Vladimir Putin, will be able to exercise some influence on the operational and tactical levels as far as how this plays out. So I think that there are going to be major military moves still today, and if necessary tomorrow. But my sense is that the way the Russian military is fighting this, they are fighting to go for value, if you will, to strike at the Ukrainian center of gravity, that is their capital, and try to wrap this up as quickly as possible. It does seem that their goals are fairly maximalist, probably including wholesale regime change in Kyiv. The ability of the Ukrainian military to resist that, I think, remains to be seen. And they want to have this wrapped up before any kind of sort of partisan force can get into formation, and that is much easier said than done. I think it's important to remember, the Ukrainian military has been training for large-scale land warfare of the sort we're seeing now. You don't just sort of flip a switch and do unconventional guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. That's a very, very different skill set. There's a reason why the United States trains a whole segment of the military in that, because it doesn't come naturally in a lot of senses. So I think that, we're looking at a few days here of what is going to be horrific, more horrific violence and bloodshed. And I think that the effort by the Russians will be to force a fait accompli as quickly as possible.
Sure, thank you. And to follow up on that, just so you can give people a picture of what that looks like, you've mentioned that you don't expect Russia to want to occupy Ukraine, but at the same time to bring down the current regime and effect change. So would you expect that their goal then is to just set up a new government in Ukraine that isn't part of Russia, but is basically Russia sympathetic, just like we've seen maybe in Crimea? Is that essentially a government from within Ukraine, but it's just allied with Russia? Is that kind of the goal that you think that Putin has in mind there?
I think that is his goal. I don't think his goal is the reincorporation of Ukraine into Russia, but I'm not certain about that. And the amount that he has talked about Ukraine as kind of a fake invented state certainly causes me to very much worry that that is the goal that he has in mind. As of right now, a lot of the language that he's used about liberating Ukraine, right? I mean, the absurd comment about denazifying Ukraine by launching an attack on a country with a democratically elected Jewish president, leads me to believe that while he probably might increase the size of and perhaps annex the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, that what he's going for in Kyiv is a compliant government, certainly not the Zelensky government. But again, I certainly would say that my confidence interval on that is not extremely high.
Sure, Professor Jentleson. If we follow along this tack and suggest that's Russia's goal, and if it achieves it, what kind of position does that put the US in? If you have a government, that is essentially set up by Vladimir Putin, that's not seen as legitimate by the rest of the world, where does that leave the US in position of how it relates to Ukraine when there isn't a regime there that it can support, but there are obviously individual Ukrainians who aren't happy about it that they do wish to support?
Yeah, and that's where you continue with some of the strategies. You'll continue some of the economic pressure. I think even though the formal Ukrainian military has been training more for conventional war, insurgencies can start. The Afghan insurgents weren't that well trained when they started working against the Soviet Union after the invasion in 1979. And again, for the Russians, I think the question really is, what serves Russia's interests, right? And that's some of the sort of Sturm und Drang you were seeing in that performance with his aides, and what you are sort of seeing from, the Russian publics. And the sense that this is not serving Russia's interests, not that, geez, we've become nice guys, creates a certain amount of pressure on Putin on sustaining this. And that's where you're going to get not saying uncle, but the basis for the kind of negotiation that could get you out of the crisis and maybe move towards a more stable, Central Europe. And the whole notion of stabilization that much harder than destabilization, you try to make it that much harder for him to stabilize. And there are a variety of ways you can do that. Countries have done that against us. And it's much easier to do that, be part of the destabilization, the stabilization. So, I think we will see a lot in the short term. And again, the notion of keeping our perspective, not just kicking everything down the road saying maybe it'll work out, but understanding that there are going to be some ups and downs and that you want a strategy that'll get you where you want to go, even if it's not in the next week to 10 days. That's crucial for the United States and for our allies and for the Ukrainians who will resist.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We're going to wrap up here momentarily, but the one thing I wanted to ask Professor Miles, obviously we've had a couple of briefings on this beforehand, and you had outlined the reasons why you hoped it wouldn't come to this, and you just mentioned that your confidence level is not all that high that this will necessarily play out how you think. This was obviously, despite the big troop build-up, a big surprise to a lot of people that the offensive actually happened. Do we have to step back and say nobody really knows what's going to happen now because Vladimir Putin is not necessarily operating according to any kind of predictable playbook? And if so, what should we be looking for? What are any reliable signs that we can point to about what might happen?
So I think that is an important point, right? That really there's only one individual who has a sense of how this is going to play out. And I think that those decisions have been made fairly quickly. He's definitely taken steps to sort of position himself to have maximum flexibility of sort of options. But even just a few days ago, maybe 4 or 5 days ago, Maria Zakharova, who is the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, was sort of, tweeting like memes about how obviously Russia's not going to do anything and this is absurd and you guys are all chicken littles. This is a person who is definitely very clued in to the way the winds are blowing. And it seems that even just a few days ago, she believed that she knew what was happening and that this was all part of kind of ginning up this fear and obviously has been proven wrong. So I think if people within what we could reasonably call the highest echelons of Russia's national security apparatus are getting this wrong, we all need to bear that in mind, right? That these are people who have a lot more access to Putin and a lot of information. I think basically for a few days, this is going to be a military activity, right? This is going to, the military sphere is going to be predominant. It was telling, for example, it was doubly telling that the Pakistani President Khan came to Moscow today, and it was telling that Putin also made time to meet with him in Moscow. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of the decisions here are being made at the operational and strategic levels and the tactical levels, above all the tactical level about what's going on here. That having, made his intent clear, the military is now carrying this out. So that's in some ways good news because the United States has significant intelligence capabilities, including what we see now, overflights by U.S. Aircraft, unmanned and manned aircraft, which are able to not only watch what the Russians are doing, but also, one hopes, intercept their communications and give notice of that, not only to the United States, but as Bruce said earlier, to the United States Ukrainian partners, as this plays out largely militarily. But yes, I think we need to have a lot of humility here because there are a lot of unknowns, and those unknowns reside, as I said earlier, in the mind of a man who doesn't seem to be fully in touch with reality, based on his really bizarre performances in some of these national security sort of fora and speeches.
Yeah, well,
absolutely. Thank you. Professor Jentleson, some closing thoughts.
Just one point on this. I think the way you approach this, I know from, when I've served in government, in the State Department a couple of times, and knowing the folks in this administration, is you don't try to predict, you do scenario planning. Because there are a couple different scenarios you want to plan for, because you can't know. You use all the intelligence sources you can to find out what Putin's thinking. But intelligence agencies usually only make predictions with levels of confidence, and they can call it high, but it's never 90 or 100%. So one scenario is that he continues on and threatens NATO member countries. Another is escalation up the ladder in Ukraine. Another is that there becomes a basis for crisis resolution and some diplomacy. And you try to fess all of those out, not so much that you move from one playbook to the other, but it helps your thinking. And what you get may be a variation on those, but it's much more effective than is just saying, we think he's going to do X and let's plan for that. So that it's a scenario-based approach that isn't infinite, but isn't just based upon one set of things you think are likely when you have limited and imperfect information.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that's the perfect place to leave it. Certainly, there is so much in this world currently that is not predictable. So scenario planning sounds like a very reassuring alternative. We'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, Professor Simon Miles and Professor Bruce Jentleson, for sharing your perspective. Obviously, everybody will be following this closely, and it's possible we'll have more briefings on this in the future. If you'd like to be notified of upcoming Duke Media briefings, please email us at dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Please stay safe and have a great day.
Take care. Stay well.
Bye, everyone.